Welcome to part 2 of our Deloitte webcast, Perspectives on Financial Accounting and Reporting. I'd like to remind viewers that our comments on this webcast represent our own personal views and don't constitute official interpretive accounting guidance from Deloitte. Before taking any action on any of these issues, it's always a good idea to check with a qualified advisor. Please note that Deloitte won't be issuing professional development certificates for attending this webcast. We encourage you to check with your provincial institutes or order regarding potential continuing professional development credits. In this session, I'm joined by Alexia Donahue, who will provide us with a securities update that will help you fulfill your financial reporting and continuous disclosure requirements. We'll then invite Jen Boldy to discuss updates on the auditor's report. Over to you, Alexia.
Thank you, John. So as John mentioned, there's a number of different regulatory sort of themes that we wanted to share with you. And although this slide refers specifically to the OSC staff notice that was issued in the fall, the ideas or trends that are communicated are consistent, I believe, with sort of the views of the other provincial securities regulators. And really, part of the notice addresses some of the trends that they've seen in the MD&As. Specifically, they're struggling and would like to remind issuers that they need to discuss and analyze changes as a result from a changes in new accounting policies. So the adoption of IFRS 15 and IFRS 9, you'll see and the disclosure of the impact thereon will be a recurring theme both in this portion of the presentation, but in our other segments. And again, it's just reiterating from the regulators that there needs to be disclosures in terms of the method of adoption and what the potential effects would be on the issuer's business. So it's not only a financial reporting or quantitative disclosure, but to the extent that there are significant changes in information systems or in internal controls, those disclosures or qualitative impacts should also be made. The other sort of feedback we'll say or trends that they're seeing in terms of MD&As is whereby results of operations aren't sort of being explained in terms of or what they believe is a sufficient level of detail or analytical discussion. So basically a statement that revenue has increased by X or by Y% without sort of an explanation of those drivers of the change is something that they're asking issuers to rethink in terms of the disclosures provided in their MD&As. The other sort of feedback that they wanted to provide or that they've communicated through the staff notice is that ensuring that risks and uncertainties are specific about the actual nature of the material risks. So users or reporting issuers should review their risk and uncertainty disclosures to make sure, one, that they're specific. So what is the risk that the entity is facing, potentially how they're addressing that risk, and then also what the impact would be either on the financial statements or the business as a whole. And the other thing is to assess whether or not the appropriate risks and uncertainties are actually being disclosed. So is in fact the discussion focused on material risks and uncertainties, or is it more boilerplate or general risks that may not necessarily have an impact on the entity? And then finally, another trend that was noted was with regards to the liquidity and capital resources. So I think really the feedback there was just ensuring that the disclosures are specific as to the period that's being discussed. So, is it the year end? Is it, year to date, comparative to the other period? Just so that people or readers actually understand the material cash requirements and potential obligations that the entity may be facing in future periods. So the other thing that came out of the staff notice were some key non-GAAP reminders. So the OSC did focus on 3 specific industries, but again, similar to the trends on the previous page, some of the observations that are specific to these industries could be applied to industries as a whole. So the first one has to do with mining issuers, and really sort of the feedback there was when they were looking at some of their non-GAAP measures, it appeared that the measures were not being applied consistently period to period or across documents. So I guess instances whereby there may be an investor's presentation or some sort of news announcement on a website that was not consistent with their continuous disclosure filings. And just a reminder that, as we move into the year-end reporting periods, that management is undertaking a I'll call it an inventory of those MD or non-GAAP measures that they've got presented both in continuous disclosure and non-continuous disclosure documents, and ensuring, one, have I appropriately labeled and identified my non-GAAP measures? Are these non-GAAP measures that I'm still using, and are they relevant to the users of these documents? And then ensuring that from period to period, the same measurement basis is made, and if not, any changes are clearly described. And just, trying to help support, we'll say, informative discussions about the operations. In terms of real estate issuers, there's been a number of comment letters that have been issued around FFO and AFFO disclosures or non-GAAP measures. And really, similar to, I think, other themes that we've seen in previous years is with around the prominence of these non-GAAP measures. And really, sort of when we take a look back, and again, if management does undertake that inventory process I just talked about, you've got tables presented in a news release or in a press release, and sort of taking a step back and assessing, do I have all non-GAAP measures presented in these tables? Are they presented above above IFRS measures, and what sort of story does that give to users or readers? And really the concern from the regulators is that an increased prominence in non-GAAP measures may distort sort of a user's understanding of the financial information, and they just want it to be clear and transparent. The other thing that they sort of made comments around is unclear adjustments. So, whether they're labeled as other items or adjustments that are labeled as non-recurring, there's concern that users will not understand what those adjustments mean, and there may be some sort of confusion or misinterpretation. And then with regards to the technology and the biotechnology issuers, again, consistent sort of themes, ensuring that the adjustments are appropriate, nothing is misleading in terms of amounts that are excluded, and my understanding that there have been, again, a number of comment letters issued in this industry with regards to disclosures around their non-GAAP measures. So the next thing we wanted to sort of highlight is there was a number of issue-oriented reviews that were, or notices that were published this year. The first of which was related to cybersecurity. So I guess just a reminder, as again we're moving into the filing of December year-end continuous disclosure requirements, specifically in the context of MD&As and AIFs, where some entities are making their risk disclosures, assessing whether or not cyber risk is a material risk, and then ensuring that the disclosures are as detailed and entity specific as possible. So, what is a cyber risk that an entity may be exposed to, and if required, should there be 2 or 3 risks associated with cybersecurity that should be disclosed? I guess on the flip side, also just a reminder to reporting issuers that there's specific reporting requirements where there has been a breach of cybersecurity, and the timely filing of such items. The next one has to do with a review of social media used by reporting issuers, and really sort of the feedback there was reporting issuers need to improve the quality of their social media disclosures, and it really just ensuring that there's not sort of selective disclosures being made through one media versus another, being information being communicated through social media versus documents that are posted on CDAR. And then with regards specifically to investment entities, so there's been an increased number of investment entities that have become reporting issuers across Canada in the last year. So really they just issued a staff notice or spent some time going through some of the recent filings, and just to sort of see what the disclosures look like and sort of where areas of improvement may be. And the feedback was really just, reminding issuers that they need to recognize the importance of the fair value and the fair value measurements. It's basically what drives the underlying values for a lot of these companies. So to the extent that entities should be making an assessment of completeness with regards to the disclosures that should be made around fair value measurements and fair value instruments that are recognized in a set of financial statements. And the other thing too was just to remind those investment entities that they need to ensure that their disclosures, specifically those around fair value, are made in such a manner that it, is it something that is necessary that I would need to make in order to make a reasonable investment decision? Then the final sort of item we wanted to touch on is with regards to women on boards. So there was an update done. There was a review of 660 non-venture issuers, specifically around their policies and disclosures regarding the representation of women on boards. And there has been an increase period over period, and really just a reminder that there needs to be a policy in place, and if not, there needs to be disclosure and explanation as to why such policies have not been adopted in the continuous disclosure documents. Lastly, just before I turn it over to auditor reporting, and I guess focused on our U.S. filers. There on this slide, we've sort of highlighted the top 10 2017 SEC comment letters. So the themes are fairly similar to what we're seeing here in Canada. Statements around non-GAAP measures and the appropriateness of adjustments that are made, as well as prominence. With regards to the MD&A, the level of detail that's being provided with regards to results of operations and around critical accounting policies and estimates. And then also with regards to acquisition, mergers, and business combinations. So this is something, again, that has been a recurring theme through the SEC comment letter process. And also, if we think back to sort of the CSA summary for 2017, and also as it cross-referenced back to 2016, specific comments that were made with regards to the appropriate identification of intangible assets and business combinations. So really just sort of food for thought in terms of those of you who are also cross-listed in the SEC in terms of items that are regulatory focus. And I guess with that, I'll turn it back over to you, John.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexia. Some helpful reminders there. Non-GAAP measures is certainly a recurring theme. We seem to see it every time we do one of these updates. And some of those staff notices are certainly signs of the times. Jen Boldy will now discuss some of the key effective dates and expected changes to the auditor's report. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, John. So after much deliberation, the Canadian Auditing and Assurance Standards Board issued new and revised auditor reporting standards effective for audits of financial statements for periods ending on or after December 15, 2018. The CPA handbook now contains the new standards, and while a number of Canadian auditing standards were impacted, the most significant changes that were made relate to CAS 700, CAS 701, which is new, CAS 720, and CAS 570. So these CASs are based on the international standards of auditing. However, there are two significant differences. First, the AASB deferred the effective date of the new and revised auditor reporting standards by 2 years to allow users sufficient time to transition. And two, the AASB amended the scope of reporting key audit matters such that they are only required to be communicated in the auditor's report when required by law or regulation, or the auditor decides to do so. Whereas under the ISAs, CAM reporting is required for audits of listed entities. So as of right now, we're not aware of any laws or regulations that require CAM reporting, but lawmakers and regulators could mandate it in the future should they see fit. And while auditors can voluntarily decide to report CAMs, in practice, this decision would normally involve discussions with management and those charged with governance on whether that would be the appropriate course of action. So we wouldn't expect this to be a decision auditors would make in isolation. Now that the PCAOB has issued their new audit reporting standard, which includes the requirement to report critical audit matters for all entities, with limited exceptions, The ASB is likely to reconsider the applicability of CAM reporting, but they have not yet communicated any updates as to the timing of any possible amendments to the standards. So overall, the auditor's report will be much longer under the new standards. And while some of the changes are intended to enhance existing communications, others are completely new. The structure and layout of the report has changed, now requiring the opinion paragraph to come first. There's a new section required called Material Uncertainty Related to Going Concern, applicable when there's a material uncertainty related to events or conditions that may cast significant doubt on the entity's ability to continue as a going concern, and where there is adequate disclosure about the material uncertainty in the financial statements. There is also an enhanced description of management's responsibilities for assessing the entity's ability to continue as a going concern and whether the use of the going concern basis of accounting is appropriate, as well as a new description related to the auditor's responsibility to conclude on the appropriateness of management's use of the going concern basis of accounting. Auditors are now required to evaluate the adequacy of management's disclosure in the financial statements for close calls relating to going concern. So that's when events or conditions are identified that may cast significant doubt on an entity's ability to continue as a going concern, but due to management's plans, the auditor concludes that no material uncertainty exists. The new requirement to consider the adequacy of disclosures for a close call situation is really an effort to send earlier warnings to investors on potential issues that may exist with respect to an entity's ability to continue as a going concern, since disclosures about material uncertainties alone was often not timely enough to be useful to stakeholders. There is additional wording required regarding the auditor's independence and ethical responsibilities for listed entities, an explicit statement to those charged with governance that the auditor has complied with relevant ethical requirements regarding independence. There are enhanced descriptions of both management's and the auditor's responsibilities and key features of an audit. There's a new section describing other information prepared by the entity containing or accompanying the entity's financial statements and auditor's report, such as an annual report, which explains management's and the auditor's responsibilities for the other information and our conclusion about whether the other information is materially inconsistent with or appears materially misstated with the financial statements or our knowledge obtained in the audit. Other information that has been obtained by the auditor as of the auditor's report date must now be reported for both listed and non-listed entities. And then for listed entities only, the auditor must also report on any other information that is expected to be obtained after the auditor's report date. Under CAS 720, other information refers to financial or non-financial information other than financial statements and the auditor's report thereon included in an entity's annual report. So for example, the management discussion and analysis. There is a new separate section to discuss key audit matters, which will make up a significant portion of the auditor's report where applicable. And finally, the auditor's report must now disclose the name of the engagement partner for listed entities. So the following diagram demonstrates the process through which auditors identify key audit matters. By definition, key audit matters are those matters that in the auditor's professional judgment were of most significance in the audit of the financial statements of the current period and are selected from matters communicated with those charged with governance. Under CAS 701, the determination of a key audit matter is based on a two-step process. First, from the matters communicated with those charged with governance, the auditor must identify which of those matters required significant auditor attention. Then of those matters, the auditor would then identify the ones of most significance in the audit of the financial statements of the current period, which would be your collection of key audit matters. There is significant auditor judgment in making the determination under the first step, and in doing so, the auditor must consider significant risk areas most susceptible to misstatements, areas that involve significant management judgment, including accounting estimates, and significant events or transactions during the year. It is expected that in most audits to which the CAM requirements apply, the auditor would identify at least one CAM. And if there are no CAMs to communicate, a statement to that effect is required to be included in the auditor's report and communicated to those charged with governance. Within the auditor's report, the description of each CAM must include why the matter was considered to be a CAM, how the matter was addressed in the audit, and reference to the related disclosure, if any, with the inherent level of auditor judgment involved in identifying CAMs, and secondly, in determining the appropriate level of detail in describing each CAM in the auditor's report, it will take considerable time to work through the process. So the following are a list of questions that should be considered and discussed amongst auditors, management, and those charged with governance regarding matters that will likely have the greatest impact on the audit and potentially on the financial statements. These significant matters relate to going concern, other information, and key audit matters where applicable. Now, with the heightened auditor focus on management's financial statement disclosures on going concern matters, including close call situations, it is important that management and those charged with governance reassess whether their going concern assessment and related processes are robust and thorough, as well as reevaluate the sufficiency and appropriateness of related disclosures. Deficient disclosures describing a close call situation could lead to a modified opinion in the auditor's report. Also keep in mind that where close call disclosures are appropriate, it could still result in a key audit matter where CAS 701 is applied, as it could be a significant or difficult auditor judgment informing the opinion on the financial statements as a whole. It's also worth mentioning that it's not always clear what constitutes other information. Management and those charged with governance should expect additional time to discuss and work through the scope of other information and related timing with the auditor, as they will need to ensure that procedures are performed on that other information as required and that it's properly disclosed in the auditor's report depending on timing of receipt. Although the new audit reporting standards are effective for audits of financial statements for periods ending on or after December 15, 2018, and while currently there's no requirement for auditors to report CAMs for any entities, management and those charged with governance should start considering the implications of the new requirements and discuss them with their auditors. Even if CAM reporting is not applicable, the new and revised audit reporting standards will have a significant impact to the audit and the related auditor's report, as well as to management's financial reporting role and to the oversight role of those charged with governance. Additional time should be expected to work through these consideration points and possibly to fine-tune processes. The extent of discussions and interactions amongst all noted parties will significantly increase and should occur much earlier in the audit process to ensure a smooth and effective implementation of the new standards. On June 1, 2017, shortly after the new CASs were released, the PCAOB issued their final new auditor reporting standard with phased-in effective dates. The new standard, excluding CAM reporting, is effective for audits of fiscal years ending on or after December 15, 2017. CAM reporting is later required for audits of large accelerated filers for fiscal years ending on or after June 30, 2019. So that would apply to entities with a market cap of greater than or equal to 700 million US. Then for audits of all other companies, with some exceptions such as emerging growth companies, for fiscal years ending on or after December 15, 2020. On October 23rd, the SEC approved the new PCAOB standard. Some of the changes made to the new PCAOB auditor's report are similar to those made under the CASs, although not as extensive. The most significant change resulting from the new PCAOB standard is the requirement to communicate critical audit matters in the auditor's report. In addition to the different terminology used, the definition and identification process in determining critical audit matters differs from that of key audit matters under the CAS. The format and matters included in the auditor's report will also differ. For example, there is a new requirement to disclose auditor tenure, which is not required under CAS. However, unlike the CAS, the new PCAOB standards did not include a robust discussion of management versus auditor responsibilities, a requirement to include the engagement partner's name in the auditor's report, or the other information or going concern matters. For dual audit reports to be used for years ending on or after December 15, 2017, the large firms are close to finalizing the templates under the current CAS standard and the new PCAOB standard, since there are fewer differences between the two. However, once the new CAS standards take effect for years ending on or after December 15, 2018, the differences between the two standards will be significant, as we have briefly discussed on the previous slide. So this leads to the key question as to whether or not a combined CAS and PCOB opinion is still possible for 2018 audit reports and onwards, which is currently being investigated. Draft dual reports that take into account the differences noted are currently being developed by the large firms to seek input from the various Canadian and U.S. regulators and stakeholders. So overall, the enhancements made to the new audit reporting model will provide stakeholders with more useful information about the entity and the audit, and ultimately provide them with more transparency into the audit process, which they have demanded for quite some time. The new requirements will improve the auditor's focus on significant areas of the audit, including the auditor's response to significant risk of misstatement, which will improve audit quality. Lastly, with the increased focus on disclosures, the quality of financial reporting should also improve. We expect the expanded auditor's report will require significant time and effort by the auditor, management, and those charged with governance, especially where CAM reporting is applied. And therefore, we encourage upfront and open dialogue between the parties noted in order to effectively plan and provide sufficient time to adopt the new auditor reporting standards. And I'll pass it back to you, John.
Thanks, Jen. Looks like audit reports are going to get a lot more interesting. In our next video, we'll hear from Kerry Daniluk and Matt Wilczynski on IFRS 9 and IFRS 15 considerations.